right, good morning, everybody. Sacred Trust 2023. When Bob O'Neill picked out the title of his book, we got music going on. What about this music, guys? We got to get that turned off. Thank you. Thank you very much. When Bob O'Neill picked the title of his book, Small But Important Riots, I thought he meant parking here on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, everybody. Didn't you? Could have used that title, Visiting Gettysburg, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. We're so happy you're back with us for 2023 Sacred Trust. On behalf of the Gettysburg Foundation, in case you don't know me, my name is Wayne Montz, and I'm honored to be the President and Chief Executive Officer here. Also, we want to give a shout out to Steve Sims, the National Park Service, Chris Guerin, the Chief of Interpretation, for helping us coordinate all that you see here, and the staff of the Gettysburg Foundation, most particularly the sales and marketing and the facilities teams, which have worked overtime to get everything ready for you here this afternoon. So we're going to kick it off this morning with Bob's presentation, and we're pleased to collaborate with the National Park Service to do so. We will have more talks in this tent, and they will remain in this tent as long as the weather cooperates, everybody. What will drive us out of this tent will not be rain, but will be storm or lightning strike within a certain distance here. If we get word of that, and we have a fancy app to tell us when we all have to run inside, we're going to be doing that, and we have a backup plan that'll be inside. So rest assured, you're not going to miss any of these programs because of a storm. So we're hoping for good. Who was here last year when Gary Adelman got run out? Okay. Isn't it ironic it was only him, right? Just him that got ran out of the tent. Let me tell you a little bit about Bob. So the talk today, Small But Important Riots, is on his brand new book, 30 Years of Perspective. These are the cavalry actions on the way up to Gettysburg, the battles of Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville. 9 days after the largest cavalry clash at Brandy Station, the horse soldiers clashed again at Aldie, Virginia. 5 more days they followed before the armies crossed the Potomac, heading for Pennsylvania. 30 years after publishing his first book-length study of battles, Bob has published and will discuss his all-new, offering new perspectives and interpretations on this aspect, cavalry aspects, on the way up to the Gettysburg Campaign. Bob is a retired police officer, Civil War historian, and author, considers his main areas of interest to the development of the Union cavalry through 1863. His website, smallbutimportantriots.com, so check that out, smallbutimportantriots.com, is the result of his continuing study. His most recent book on these cavalry battles was published by Potomac Books, which is a University of Nebraska 2022 imprint. I've known Bob for many years, and he is one of the best when it comes to cavalry operations in the Army of Potomac. There's hardly anybody that knows more about it than he does. And we're speared kinsmen because we spend a lot of time working on the regular Army, and I see him a lot at the National Archives, which means a lot of this stuff that you're seeing here, unpublished, first stuff that you see, thanks to Bob O'Neill. So help me welcome, as our first speaker, 2023 Sacred Trust, Robert O'Neill. My friend. Appreciate it, Cal.
I think after that introduction, the only way I can go is down. So, if you make a mad rush out here, I'll understand it in a few minutes. I can't really wander far. I tend to wander a little bit. Everybody can hear me, though, well enough in the back. So as Wayne said, first let me thank everybody, Wayne, Carol, everybody with the foundation who puts this on every year, invited me to be a part of it this year, and also all of you for coming out to see something you probably, most of you don't know. So I appreciate you being here. Hopefully I don't disappoint you. We're going to, as Wayne said, let me see if I can get this going the right way. I had some sage advice initially to get to the shooting as soon as I could, not to do a lot of preamble. And so what I did is I saw Jeff Wirt's presentation from last year, and then I copied that line, get to the folks shooting each other, from Jeff Wirt's presentation. So we're going to get to that as quick as we can, but I do want to give you, those of you that don't know where the Loudoun Valley is and the importance of it, a quick geography lesson on that, a quick overview of the fighting. We're not going to get real down and dirty with it. Hopefully I'll give you enough that you'll inspire you to buy the book. We will discuss two new interpretations. I want to leave most of that for the book. And then I'll offer my idea of some of the impacts on the later campaign. So as the campaign progresses, how this fighting plays a role in that. Hopefully I'm going to get this right. So to your left, as you look at this, you will see the Shenandoah Valley, and then coming towards the center, you'll see the Blue Ridge Mountains. And if you come to your right, you'll see Bull Run Mountain. That becomes Catoctin Mountain as it goes north. And the big oval area is roughly the Loudoun Valley. Those of you that traveled a distance here, one, we appreciate you doing so. But the Loudoun Valley is almost entirely in Loudoun County, Virginia. Some of it will dip down into the northern tier of Fauquier County, but that is the significance of the name there and where it is. And, you know, for our purposes today, why the Loudoun Valley? Why did the cavalry clash there? And if you were the Federals and you needed to go find Lee's army that you had a suspicion was moving in the Shenandoah Valley, you needed to get across the Loudoun Valley to do so. And the only way to do that is to get through the mountain gaps. So you see 4 of them indicated there. Again, on to the left, Snickers Gap at the top, Ashby's Gap below that, and then to the right edge. Am I doing that right or wrong? I'm going to get confused. All right. And then you see Aldie Gap and Thoroughfare Gap below. Now, there are other gaps in the mountains, but these are the 4 that are going to be the main concern for the two sides. So you get access through the mountains, through those gaps. And then the other significance is the roads. The 2 best roads across the valley were the Snickersville Turnpike running northwest from Aldie through Snickers Gap, and the Little River Ashby's Gap Turnpike. It changes names at Aldie. So it's Little River from Aldie to Alexandria. Ashby's Gap to the west of Aldie runs almost due west, as you see there on the map. So if you want to get across there, these are what they knew then in the Civil War as improved roads. In the 19th century terminology of macadamized, these were macadamized roads, but they're not the macadam we know today. They were stone roads, a very fine surface on the top, and maintained because it was a toll road prior to the war. But during the war, obviously that money's not there, and these roads were probably in pretty bad shape. But they were still the best roads to do that. They got right through the gaps. So you see they all come together at Aldie, and that pretty much is going to force the combat to begin at that location. So there are the 3 towns along the Ashby's Gap Turnpike, the lower edge, pretty much, of the Loudoun Valley. And then, as I said, we're going to get as quickly to the shooting as we can. So on June 16th, and I did not put any infantry in here, we just would have cluttered that up. You probably know more about that than I do. So on June 16th, Hooker's headquarters, somewhere between Fairfax Courthouse and Fairfax Station. Pleasanton's cavalry is by and large concentrated along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad near Manassas, and 1 brigade of his is already blocking Thoroughfare Gap. We'll talk more about why that is in a few minutes, but that is going to be one of Hooker's main concerns, and there's going to be a brigade there the entire period of time that we're going to discuss today. The Federals had been moving since June 9th. So when Wayne said this falls after the Battle of Brandy Station, the Federals have been active ever since, and there's been no rest. They've been on picket duty, scouting patrols, and what have you. The Confederates had rested for most of the week following the Battle of Brandy Station, and only on June 16th do they begin moving into the Loudoun Valley. Stuart is going to resume a role he had been interrupted in by the fight at Brandy Station, and that is screening Lee's army. So on the night of June 16th, 3 brigades will move up as you see here. So on the morning of the 17th, that's essentially how the cavalry is arrayed. So how's the combat then develop? We talked about the geography of the area. The 2 less exciting roles of cavalry, scouting and screening. So we all know what scouting is. Screening is to protect your army, your infantry, from the eyes of the enemy. And in actuality, both men, Alfred Pleasanton commanding the Cavalry Corps Army of the Potomac, and Jeb Stuart commanding the Cavalry Division of the Army of Northern Virginia, had been tasked with exactly the same thing. We'll talk more about that. If you're starting to shake your head and go, wait a minute, what's he saying up here? We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But they had been tasked with screening. That was to prevent the 2 sides from finding each other, and they were going to do it at the same spot. The Federals meant to block the gaps at Bull Run Mountain. Stuart meant to do the same thing. Stuart knows that by coming all the way across the Loudoun Valley to Bull Run Mountain, that he has the opportunity, should the Federals appear, to trade distance for time. He doesn't need to get into a knockdown, drag-out fight where his cavalry division is going to be potentially destroyed or another Brandy Station is going to take place. So he will, if he needs to, he will fight and fall back and fight and fall back. So he's not in that kind of a fight. And that's what he's going to do, and he's going to do it magnificently, although that will be one of the controversies after the fighting that we'll talk about at the very end. So Pleasanton moves up from the railroad on the 16th up to the Little River Turnpike towards Aldie. But as I will talk about in more detail in a minute, it's hard to ignore now. His orders are not to go find the enemy. His orders are to prevent the enemy from finding him. So the biggest misconception of everything that's ever gone before is, oh, he's supposed to go find the enemy, and that's not true. But he is going to pull up to Aldie, and he knows militarily the smart thing to do is not stop on the wrong side of the mountain gap in case he has to fight for it the next day. The smart thing to do is go through the gap. And when he does that, that will precipitate the fighting. Now, if everything had gone one day differently, in other words, if the Federals had moved into the Loudoun Valley on June 16th, it is conceivable there would have been no fighting. They would have gone through, turned north, and there would have been no contact. At the same time, if Jeb Stuart had moved in one day differently, one day later, the Federals would have been through and gone, he would have moved through, and there would have been no fighting. This is completely unexpected. What happens on June 17th and dictates everything going forward is unexpected. So when Tom Mumford reaches Aldie to block Aldie Gap, he has already gone into bivouac. His men are off their horses. Some of them are out scouting for food, but they're already into bivouac for the night. So that's proof that they are not expecting what's going to happen. Now, some of you who were here last year, you heard Jeff Harding, the battlefield guy, give a talk on his book, but some of you have probably seen his discussion. He's done some articles on all the historical weather reports that he found. Anybody here, whether it was in Gettysburg Magazine or Civil War News, Civil War Times, without going into that a lot, we now know that the heat index on June 17th, at the time the fighting starts, is 118 degrees. All right? 118 degrees. We lose our minds now, right? The meteorologist starts showing us red alerts and orange alerts and all this kind of nonsense if it gets to about 100, 105. I don't think it got over 105 where we live last year. There'd been no rain for about 6 weeks by the 17th. That will change shortly, but there'd been no rain at this point. Significant rain. We know how rain is in this area in the summer. So the creeks are all dry. There's no water for the men or horses. And the dust is nearly impenetrable. That's going to affect all the combat, especially at Aldie. They cannot see each other. When you read these descriptions, I'm not going to go into it here today, they started to go after their comrades. Men are coming back from the head of a column, they're turning around, they've been wounded, And all these guys do behind them is see somebody coming toward them and they start to shoot them or saber them because they cannot distinguish who they're fighting. That's how tough this day is going to be, both for the men and the animals, and we'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. So conversely, why is Stuart screening? Well, we already know he's screening for the Army in general. That microphone, I'm going to keep banging it the whole morning. But Longstreet's troops, as I'm sure most of you know, are actually moving. They're not west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. They are moving through the Loudoun Valley. So where this fighting is going to end up on June 21st is where Longstreet's infantry is on the morning of the 16th, 17th. The infantry will eventually go into bivouac to block Ashby's Gap and Snickers Gap. So they're going to have artillery there, infantry there, and this will become an issue we'll talk about in just a few minutes. So that kind of sets the stage. Stuart has done exactly what Pleasanton has done earlier. He sent a brigade to block Thoroughfare Gap. He's got Robertson's North Carolinians at a point where they can reinforce either of the other two brigades, and Tom Mumford is blocking Aldie Gap. And about 4:30 in the afternoon, his scouting parties to go out and look at what's ahead, and the federal scouting parties looking west to see what's ahead of them as they come through the gap are going to run into each other, and the combat will begin. It's probably lasts no more than an hour that day. One of the things I came to appreciate as I worked on this is that when we think of cavalry combat, men on horses charging back and forth, it does not, at Brandy Station, it's a 14-hour battle, but they're not charging back and forth for 14 hours. The horses, even if the men could, the horses cannot sustain that. And that is going to be a factor in all this. I suspect, although I don't really have any great evidence to it, that this whole thing lasts at most an hour and probably less than an hour. It will develop early on along the Ashby's Gap Turnpike in an area we talk about today as the Haystacks fight. This shows the end of it. It is, as I said earlier, a surprise to both sides, and Stuart and Tom Rosser with the 5th Virginia will leave 2 companies of men. These are the men that have carbines in his regiment, the 5th Virginia, on this knoll. Stuart grouped his carbines differently than the Federals did, but we can talk about that away from here. So he leaves the men with the carbines there to defend it, and in 2 attacks, the Federals will take rather heavy losses. They're going to be on horseback. The Southerners are going to be off their horses on foot. The Federals will drive them off that knoll back to the area of the Adam farmhouse and force them to surrender. This is believed to be the first time an organized body of Stuart's men in this size had surrendered in combat during the war. The Confederate casualties are not significant. This is not, if you've seen a letter Tom Rosser wrote about all this bloody affair and all the men they lose, casualty figures do not bear that out. But they will inflict heavy losses on the 2nd New York and the troops that are attacking them. But after this, the fighting is going to shift to the other road. Some of you may have seen this drawing by Forbes. If you can read at the bottom here, you will see it's done on June 24. So he was not a witness to the fighting, and so he has depicted it erroneously. But the terrain there is probably pretty accurate, maybe a little dramatic. But you see the haystacks at one point there. That gave it the fight, but there are no mounted Confederates there. The Federals are attacking on horseback against dismounted Southern troopers along that little knoll you see there. The larger fight is going to take place on the Snickersville Turnpike. And it is, without going into a great amount of detail, it's a matter of, if it's true, quote Nathan Bedford Forrest, the firstest with the mostest. It's a constant shift of who has the most troops at the critical point at the critical time. So the advantage goes kind of back and forth early on. And then the Southerners are going to, as you will see there, make an ever stronger position behind a stone wall at the bend in the road by the Fur House. And they will begin to inflict staggering casualties on the Federals as they attack. And we'll talk about that again as at the end. But by, like I said, no more than an hour, all this takes place. Two things are going to happen that are going to be misinterpreted by the other side because they only know their version of it. The Federals will make one last attack up the road and in the fields, and they will see Mumford's men pull out, and they're going to think they've won a tactical victory. They have forced the Federals out of there, or the Confederates. In actuality, Stuart, for reasons I'm not going to go into now, but it's in the book, will send an order to Mumford saying, look, things have changed. I need you to withdraw. And it all happens pretty much simultaneously. So Mumford withdraws. He's very upset about withdrawing. As he said, I've been piling up Yankees here all day. I want to keep doing it, but Stuart needs them to leave. It was the smart thing to do, and the Federals will misinterpret it. They go, oh, we finally drove them out of there. Those of you that have read the book, you may know, you look at those maps that were there. You see I termed them the fiery ordeal. That's a comment from a soldier in the 1st Massachusetts writing home before they've ever been in combat, before they've ever left. He writes this line down here, and he will never see combat because one battalion of the regiment will spend the entire war at Hilton Head Island, Edisto, in that area. I don't think they had any golf courses there at the time, but they're going to be down there, and that's where he will be. But the regiment, the other 2 battalions, will go through this fiery ordeal at Aldie. This is believed to be the first monument put up by Union troops on a Southern battlefield. I can't vouch for that, but it's believed to be that. And that's right there at the southern position at the bend in the road. If some of you haven't been there, this is to the left. If you're one of the Southern Carbineers, that's the bend in the road, and that's your view of it. And this is a picture taken probably about 1993 or 94 when the book first came out. The column obviously would have been quite a bit longer than that, but it gives you a sense of what a Union column of cavalry moving up that road. It's just a mass target that these guys just have to put in. They don't have to aim their guns. And so they're so dusty, the troops are, that one will write that I could see my bullets hitting because I saw the puff of dust off their uniforms. So on the 18th, Pleasanton will send out 2 strong reconnaissance patrols. Again, we think he's not doing this, but he does. 2 brigade strength patrols up the Snickersville Turnpike and the Ashby's Gap Turnpike. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But on the 19th, the next large battle occurs. I say large, is in time scale, it's much longer than the Battle of Aldie. It takes quite a while. Much of it is a very long skirmish because the Federals have to attack over open ground against cavalry protected by stone walls, artillery, and woods. And they're not in a big hurry to do this. Most of them are off their horses. Eventually, as the day gets drug out, they're going to get a preemptory order to attack, and then this battle will end pretty quickly. And this is a depiction pretty much of how that takes place at the end of the day. The heaviest fighting, there's now a park there. If any of you haven't been there, there's now a 5-acre park right where that blacksmith shop is at the center of the fighting. That's where Harris von Bork, one of Stuart's favorite aides, is shot in the neck and will be wounded, and that will be the end of his military career with Stuart. He's going to be there. But Stuart's only going to fall back about a half or 3/4 of a mile to the next ridge. Again, he's pulling out time and distance. He's not getting himself cornered into a fight he can't win. He's going to inflict all the punishment he can on the Federals and then pull out. As I was going through pension records for the book, I was thrilled to find this picture in one of them. He is a trooper in the 2nd New York Cavalry who was killed at the north side of the fighting. So up where you see Kilpatrick up there, he would have been killed somewhere up there. He was one of 4 brothers who all served in the Federal Army. One brother died 3 days before him. He was killed, and I haven't looked at their records, but one of them dies 3 days before. He dies on the 19th. His father will write that they all died during the war. They don't actually do that. One dies in 65, one dies shortly thereafter that. but I don't know that they didn't die from injuries inflicted during the war. And this is a depiction by Woad about the fighting, the dismounted fighting, and this is, I'm sure many of you have seen this. This is done at Middleburg. He's probably pretty close to this and doing this in person, and this is kind of what it would have looked like with the Union troopers on a dismounted skirmish line. Their horses would have been towards the back of the image there. The blacksmith shop still stands. The road below the blacksmith shop is really the key to the battle, how things develop when the Federals get back and find that road. It will bring them right in to Stuart's position and force him to retire. And to the right is a monument that was put up right before COVID, I think in 2019, if I recall, done all through private funds by a man who runs the 1st Maine Cavalry Living History organization to the men who were killed from that regiment, to include their colonel who's killed at Aldie in one of the last attacks there. So there's no fighting on June 20th either. Now there's been some rain in and out of here. The temperature started to come down a bit. But what's important to keep in mind is that the Federals thought that Stuart had mounted infantry with him. Now, a lot of people say, oh, yeah, that's some nonsense that Alfred Pleasanton was spewing. But in reality, the first person to report that is John Buford. And most people don't link John Buford's intelligence abilities with Alfred Pleasanton's. So John Buford thought before the Battle of Brandy Station that the South had mounted some infantry on horseback. So here, with the stone walls, Stuart's tremendous use of terrain, the casualties they are inflicting, the Federals now believe, in fact, Stuart does have mounted infantry, and so they will ask for infantry support of their own, and they will get a brigade that needs no introduction to this group right here. This is Strong Vincent's brigade from the 5th Corps. I will tell you, hopefully not disappoint anybody, Joshua Chamberlain is not here. He has been, depending on what account you read, he's either got sunstroke from the heat or he's got an attack of malaria from earlier in the war. But he's not going to be leading a 20th Maine. But the idea is that they're going to use this infantry brigade. Hooker does not want, they have a whole division at their beck and call, but he doesn't want them used. They don't want to take a chance on precipitating a much larger affair, as will happen up here on July 1st. So they pretty much use the one brigade. They have already marched from the east of Aldie, so it's 6 miles from Aldie to Middleburg. This battlefield's a mile west of there, so they probably marched about 10 miles that day already. And they're going to carry the fight as long as they can. The idea is that they'll sweep around with the infantry. The cavalry will kind of sit off to the north side of the battlefield, waiting for an opportunity if they get the Southerners running to kind of turn this into a rout, and it never happens. One of the men who was killed, so this shows you the very first skirmish there. They'll fall back to a second position at Cromwell's Run, and then they'll fall back to a third and a fourth and finally a fifth position. This is the longest day of the three. It will become by far the largest of the three battles. But Captain William Houston, and I'm told I'm not from North Carolina, I'm told in Duplin County that it's not Houston, it's Houston. He is with the 1st North Carolina that you see down at the bottom of the map. And he is killed in the retreat from here. He is buried at Middleburg. You can find his headstone in a cemetery there. But some friends of ours, some of you may know the late Horace Mewborn, who was not from Duplin County, but he had all the contacts that we needed. He knew a judge. He had a very good friend who was a judge in Duplin County. He knew the county manager there. We got in right kind of not too long before COVID shut things down. They took me back to where this painting hangs, and I was able to get an image of Captain Houston, who had been a politician, thank you, sir, a politician prior to the war, was very well respected by his men, but they'd been out there in this heat, and as they start to retire, he has to stop and take a rest, as one account goes, and when he gets up, and starts off again. He's not on his horse. He'll take a bullet in the head. So this depicts just what I described a second ago. The infantry fighting is over where you see that limber exploding. That's one of James Hart's artillery limbers from his Southern Horse Artillery Battery. That is pretty much a landmark view for where the Ashby's Gap Turnpike is. So the infantry is fighting from that point off to the south, or my left there as I look at it, and you see the cavalry waiting north of the turnpike to exploit an advantage which does not happen. At the same time, they have sent John Buford's division even farther around the flank to try to rout Stuart out of there as well, and we'll talk about him in a minute. So the importance of the gaps again, as I said earlier, Longstreet had gone into position at Snicker's Gap and Ashby's Gap, and he's going to get an order that says from Lee, telling him to prepare to move. Prepare being the key word, and Longstreet decides to move, and he will pull his men off the mountain, away from those gaps, uncovering them. They had been there in case things went bad on the 19th, and now they're across the river. Well, it's been raining now off and on for a couple of days. There's a very heavy storm comes in, and the river would have been very difficult at this point to get across. But I think I think they will lose getting the artillery back across 1,000 rounds of ammunition. So imagine what 1,000 extra rounds of ammunition might have done for one corps artillery train here. But it's going to take a while to get them back into position. And so Stuart knows he has got to fight now much more tenaciously. He can't just move back too quickly. So he's going to drag us out as quickly as he can. So the third phase is at a little place called Rector's Crossroads. That's a delaying action because the Southerners need to get across Goose Creek Bridge. Oh, I changed the slide and I didn't get it in here. So you see right in the center there, the bridge, I had a picture of it I was going to put in here and I didn't until too late. Then they're going to get very high ground. They're going to put parts of 3 artillery batteries up on very dominating ridges, where you see it, again, to the left side of the map there for me. And the Federals are going to bring up a much more dominating amount of artillery pieces here. Now, this may be hard for some of you to believe. I believe the cannonade that happens here, by the best evidence I have, lasts as long as the cannonade at Pickett's Charge. I'm not telling you it's the same size as the cannonade at Pickett's Charge, and not as many guns. But there's a very long cannonade here for a couple of purposes. One, it allows the infantry to catch their breath, the Federal infantry, and it allows time for the Southern infantry to get back across the river. So there's a couple purposes there, but it's mostly a cannonade battle here that is not going to inflict a lot of casualties. And once everything's set in motion, the Federal infantry will sweep across the bridge, and by and large, Stuart's just going to order his cavalry to retire. He's not ready to make a stand here any longer because he knows he can get pinned in trouble here. Hart's battery, in part, they've already lost one limber. That means they had, I think, one gun dismounted in the morning from the heavy recoil of the fighting. They're going to lose 2 more dismounted here. They're not going to lose the guns to the enemy. They're going to lose the ability to use them until, and as I'm sure some of you know, they're going to go to Martinsburg, get repaired, and get up to Gettysburg in time for the latter part of the fighting. So this is the middle 2 phases through the afternoon. But then I said Buford had been moving by the flank, and this is one of the 2 interpretations I am going to talk about kind of quickly. How many of you read Wilbur Nye's Here Come the Rebels? So in 1965, he wrote the very first real account of these cavalry battles. There was no template prior to that, and then I tried in 1993 to take his 2 chapters and make that into a book. And I had the man, John Devine, who lived there, had been his guide through the area to help me with it. And this is just quickly show you how interpretation of this battle has changed because there was nothing there to go on. Now I thought and I hope this is clear enough for you. Now, I thought the fighting had been concentrated at an entrance off the Trap Road to a place called Ayrshire Farm. The Ayrshire Farm is still there today. You can still go. That driveway entrance is still there. It actually has a sign that tells you this is a drive to Ayrshire Farm. And he thought everything was concentrated around there. When I looked at it, I knew the area between Ayrshire Farm and, so you see my map from 1993, the circle over the same spot. The area in between those was all wooded. And I knew it was wooded. I'd developed enough information that it was wooded at the time. And so cavalry combat in there, moving artillery through there didn't seem reasonable, but the way they talked about the stone walls and the layout of the walls, it seemed reasonable to bring that fighting down to another wall, which you see circled at the bottom. But any of you who have ever been on a tour with me out there know that more than anything else, I knew there were problems with the interpretation of this battle. So I was never real comfortable even with the artillery position at the top, but everyone believed the Union skirmishers or carbineers had been back, as you see in the map on the left there with the big oval. The problem with that is that's a mile from where they are to the Trap Road. No carbine in the day is going to reach that distance, and artillery is going to be at their maximum distance to get to that road. Shortly after I published the book, someone gave me a diary from a trooper in the 7th Virginia Cavalry who said they had to fight because the Federals had established a roadblock. And there's no way anything could be considered a roadblock if they can't put fire on that position. So this position had to be wrong. The problem was how to figure out where the new position was. If you know this area, you know that these are some of the wealthiest people in the country. Very large properties. We're very lucky that they do. They maintain them. They keep them the way they are. But you just don't go knock on the door and go, hey, you mind if I go walk around out here for a few minutes? They don't do it. I got an invitation, again, I think it was the Christmas of 2018 or 2019, to walk that property. And that was the eureka moment, because the wall you see at the bottom, you can see, especially in the wintertime, from the road. So I always knew that wall was there. That wall shows up on all the maps. You cannot see the wall that runs off in that direction, if you can see that pointer. And you see the key house now is in the back in the trees there. This is only a couple hundred yards from the road. It's within carbine range of the road. This is a roadblock as we knew the fighting developed. So, those positions are wrong. That position's wrong. Chew's battery was not at either of the first two, but here they're caught right in the middle of the road by the carbineers opening fire on them. Chew has no choice but to stand and fight. And you can see now where the carbineer position was, and all the fighting is going to develop around that position, not as it had been earlier depicted. As you see depicted there, the Confederates are going to be attacking this Union position, as you see there. This is a close-up of the house. The area where the boxwood is all orchard at the time of the battle, and all of the fighting is going to take place, much of it, there and in the field. The trooper who wrote that letter about the diary entry about the roadblock, his brother's going to be killed in that orchard. His horse is going to be killed in that orchard. So it made a moment on his mind there. So this is a carbineer's view, if you're a Yankee, looking from that Keystone Wall across it where the wood line is, where I thought the artillery was, and all that field there is what I call the center of the storm now. A lot of, but it's very brief. That's what it was hard for me to understand how so much could happen in so short a period of time. So this is another wad drawing. I do not think he sees this in person, but I've never had an opportunity to go where he might have. And I gave this talk a couple weeks ago, and somebody goes, I can get you into that house. But I never just went and knocked on the door. I think this depicts the end of Buford's attack. I believe this depicts, and there's nothing on there to say this, the 17th Pennsylvania, Devon's brigade charging across the field. I believe where you see Southern Cavalry in formation, that's Beverly Robertson's brigade, waiting to attack a battle we're going to talk about in a second. You see the artillery, Chew's artillery already retreating from there, and this is the very end of that fight. At the same time, a very vicious fight is taking place within eyesight of this. And this drawing is by Waud, and I believe this is drawn in person and is drawn from a house that still stands there. And for all of you, that's Rodder's section of Caliph's Battery. I don't need to introduce that to, I'm sure, any of you here, what's going to happen on July 1st. This is the culmination, the beginning of the culmination of the large fight at Upperville. It's called the Vineyard Hill Fight because of the trees you see at the left of that image. My left again. It's not a grape vineyard. Don't ask me why it got called that. They believe these are orange Osage trees, some of which are still out there. But by 3 estimates, this fight right here lasts only 15 minutes. And you're going to go, well, what's the big deal about this then, O'Neill? It can't be that big a deal. If I had a chance to sit somewhere where I knew I wasn't going to be a casualty and watch this fight, as I'll show you in a second, you could see Buford's fight from here. The Federals saw them. They cheered each other going to the attack. You have 9 brigades of cavalry fighting in a very short distance of space. 9 brigades. That does not, you do not see that at Brandy Station. No matter what anyone says how big that battle is, it's a bigger field. You cannot see all of that because of the way the terrain goes. They're not all going at one time. For 15 to 30 minutes, they're all attacking at the same time. The descriptions of this fight are, as I said, they're just vicious. The Confederates have been retreating for 3 days now. They have retreated 4 times this day, and they are tired of it. They know they're going to have to do it again, and they're going to put a whipping on the Yankees as much as they can, but it's not going to be what they hope. So if you can see Buford's attack going up at the top. The attack I just showed you, you see the 2 diagrams there. If you put them together, it would look something like this with a little bit of an overlap. So the image on the left, my left again, with the vineyard, is a little east of the image over here to the right of that screen. But that is all happening at one time. There's only 1 Federal brigade in the entire Cavalry Corps that's not in that fight, and there's only 1 Confederate brigade of Stewart's division not in that fight. So, as I said, if I could watch the fight from somewhere, I would love to have seen this one, and she did. She lives at this house, still stands. You can see it circled at the bottom of the map there. And luckily for us, she kept a diary of it. She got everybody to safety, got as much as she could of the valuables of the family away so the Yankees didn't come in and steal it all. And she went up on one of these balconies, and she kept an hour-by-hour account of what she saw. And we're very lucky that she did that. So now I want to talk about the last thing before we get you out of here. How am I doing on time? I forgot to set my timer. I always do. So I want to talk about the relationship between Pleasanton and Hooker, and really the idea that I had gotten wrong, everybody had, that said I need to redo this book. So the idea has always been that Hooker had agreed to send his cavalry out to look for Lee's infantry. And that's all based on at least 13 messages in the official records that take place on the night of June 16, morning of June 17, in which Hooker appears to agree with Abraham Lincoln, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, General Henry Halleck, the General-in-Chief, that he's going to do this. And just as one example, I used it as a chapter heading in the first edition, that he will drive in pickets if necessary and get us information. It's better that we should lose men than to be without knowledge of the enemy. This seems to be a clear-cut idea that I'm going to send my cavalry out and go find them, and that is not at all what Hooker actually told him. Hooker agrees with his superiors that I'm going to tell my cavalry to do this, and then he tells his cavalry something entirely different. So we know this how. One of his aides at the time is a man I'm sure you all recognize the name, Captain Ulrich Dahlgren. He sends him out with a verbal order. Now, in an age of conspiracy theories, I don't want to act like we have a conspiracy going on here. But there's a reason to send a verbal order. There's no written record of it. And that verbal order is, I don't care what I just told Lincoln, we're not going to do it. All right? You're going to tell Pleasanton that he is not to go into the Loudoun Valley. You are to explicitly tell him that. So that order, we don't have it, but when he gets out there, he has to let Hooker know what Pleasanton's reply is, and we found that. And so it says here, General Pleasanton is between Sudley Springs and Aldie. Sudley Springs is on the Manassas battlefield, about 9 miles east of Aldie. He wants to push his whole command on to Aldie. I will wait here for an answer. While he's waiting for the telegraph to get back to him, he writes in his memo book, Pleasanton wants to push on, dust shows our move, we should. Now, when I wrote the book first time, I knew that. I'd seen that, but everyone goes, you can't trust Pleasanton. He's a big liar. We all know that, right? And actually, Pleasanton tells the Committee on the Conduct of the War the following spring exactly what in truth happened. He confirms everything, but again, everyone's can't trust him. So sometime after 3:30, now about an hour before the fight starts, a reply comes back. Now it's on the telegraph. It's the only way to get it to Hooker or Dahlgren in time. Written instructions are now being prepared for General Pleasanton. We shall send them from here at 4 o'clock. This order never reaches Pleasanton. Why? Because John Mosby captures this order. And any of you that know anything about John Mosby know that on the night of June 17th, he will capture the orders being, the officers being, that are carrying this order, and so Pleasanton never sees it. Well, by then it's too late. By the time this would have arrived, they've already fought the battle, and it's too late. Pleasanton has gone through Aldie, but the late Horace Mewbourne found the order in North Carolina. So we know that the very first thing on that order, presumably the most important thing to Joseph Hooker, under no circumstances advance your main body of cavalry beyond Aldie. So if you're supposed to go to the Shenandoah Valley and find Lee's infantry, you're not going to accomplish it by doing what he's being told. This order, of course, doesn't reach Pleasanton right away, so he sends the reconnaissance out on the 18th I told you about, I said I'd get back with. Everyone thought, well, why does he recover them on the afternoon of the 18th? They're like, Pleasanton was a coward. It was this, he was that, he got scared. In actuality, the orderly that had been with these two officers escapes during the night, gets back to Army headquarters, tells them, look, Mosby captured the order, and they will reissue the order. And when that order, the second copy of it reaches Pleasanton, he goes, oh, I disobeyed yesterday and I've disobeyed again, and he calls his cavalry back. All right? So I hope that is clear. Yes, Pleasanton disobeyed his orders, but he disobeyed his orders to do exactly what we've always accused him of not doing. His doing that precipitates the fighting, and as I said, he does it again the next day. So how did the fighting alter the campaign? Well, as you see on this map, those two mountain chains that we talked about are like a big spearhead pointed right at Gettysburg. As I looked at that, it's the first thing that jumps off that map. But we'll quickly go down there. There's no discussion, and the last thing Wayne's going to want to do is get into a discussion about what I think of Stuart's ride, because that'll throw the whole schedule off.
That's another talk.
That's another talk. But this idea is generated during this period of time. He will meet John Mosby twice on June 17th. And then he's going to get that Mosby will capture the order. They know Mosby called the order the open sesame to all of Hooker's plans. They know everything. That order is explicit. Where the infantry is, where the other cavalry is, everything they want to know. So that, I think, helps grow this idea, and it happens as a result of the fighting. But for the fighting, it probably would not have. Stuart would have just moved up the Bull Run, Catoctin mountain chain, continued to screen the army. There may have been fighting somewhere else later on, but it wasn't going to happen here. There probably would have been no raid. When he makes the raid, he is doing so now with exhausted men and exhausted horses. Where he rested after Brandy Station, and the Federals didn't, that's going to reverse. The Federals will rest after the fighting in the Loudoun Valley, and Stuart will not. And so he's going to know, as you all know, he's going to have to stop every day for long periods of time to rest his horses and try and recoup them. He would write afterwards. And I just saw an article in Gettysburg Magazine from the earlier issue this year that really just tears Stuart a new one. Says, he came up with this idea about my horses were all worn out from the fighting along in the Loudoun Valley and the Stone Roads. I don't think that's made up by Stuart at all. I think it's very accurate. The horses, Pleasanton would write, after the Battle of Aldie. They had changed because, again, I don't want to drag us out, but the quartermaster had agreed to lower the minimum age of horses they would give to the cavalry from 6 years to 5 because of the demand for them at this point in the war. In Pleasantville, right after the fighting on June 17th, all the 5-year-old horses you just gave me all gave out. So they're fighting in 118-degree heat. They're fighting on these roads. They've been marching all day. I think everything that Stewart writes about his horses is true, and that's what he's going to wind up starting with. Both of them, if you combine the losses here and the losses at Brandy Station, they're pretty much equal. The Federals are going to lose in 5 days the amount of men they lost in 1 day at Brandy, same with the Confederates. It will work out to at least a brigade of cavalry on both sides. So they're going to go into the Gettysburg Campaign having lost that many men, killed, wounded, or captured. I believe the Federals alone lose 1,000 horses in this fighting. That's 1,000 men who do not show up as killed, wounded, or captured, but do not have a horse to contribute to the fighting. We will never really appreciate how cavalry fighting, we look at those figures in the ORs, they get a present for duty strength. To me, that's all a bunch of nonsense. It's a mirage about what they thought they had. On the march from the Potomac River to Gettysburg, one regiment, there's no cavalry fighting. As I understand it, there's no reason for those horses to exert themselves. One regiment will lose 72 horses. If you take 72 horses and work that out over the corps, they will lose more than 1,000 horses doing basically nothing except marching up to Gettysburg. So those men are not going to be there. You get the 3 young generals. We don't need to talk a lot about that, Custer, Farnsworth, and Merritt. They're going to have an effect on the Union Cavalry Corps for the remainder of the war, of course, except, unfortunately, for Farnsworth. Why does that seem important? Well, because that comes out of this fighting. A lot of folks will say Pleasanton wasn't a battlefield commander. He wasn't there. He is there all the time. He's watching these men fight. He knows what Custer does at Aldie and Upperville. I didn't talk about it. He knows what Merritt does at Upperville. He knows the disarray of the reserve brigade. He will ask for Merritt to be promoted the very next day. That's how disappointed he is with the command of the reserve brigade, and then he will get an opportunity to do so a couple of days later. So I think that's key. And then finally, the morale on both sides. The Federals, everyone looks at the Battle of Brandy Station and goes, this is the turning point of the Union cavalry. I'm just going to make my argument and say that's fine, except at the end of the day, who retired? Who retreated? And it was the Federals. The Federals turned around after fighting for 14 hours and went back home, all right? After about 10 hours at Upperville and 4 days of fighting, they've seen nothing but the back of the Southern cavalry. And now, by the end of the day on the 21st, the enemy cavalry is not just walking away from them, they are running away from them. So that is the key. They will stay there overnight. They'll retire because they want to retire, not because they have to retire. So they're going to go into the rest of the campaign with their morale sky high. At the same point, the Confederates have never done this before. They've never run from the enemy cavalry. They're going to get up on the Ashby's Gap Mountain. It's going to be kind of cold, rainy up there. They're going to be around Longstreet's infantry. All right, we don't need to talk about that conflict between infantry and cavalry. There's going to be a lot of infighting there. The officers are not happy with the officers. The men are not happy with the way they've been led. So they're going to go into the campaign with their morale probably as low as it's ever been. What has to be noted is with all the controversy about Jeb Stuart, and it's going to get worse. It goes from all the controversy after Brandy, it's going to get worse after Upperville. He does exactly what he was asked to do. He does it magnificently, and he's never given any credit for it. So I thank you for your attention. If I still have time, Wayne, I'll do whatever I can question-wise, and then I'll see you as long as I can elsewhere. Thank you.
All right, listen, you want to know more, you got to go in and buy Small But Important Riots. Now, we're going to send Bob right around the table. He'll be signing books there. Please get your copy. We're going to look forward to seeing you all back here at 11 o'clock. Dr. Allison Johnson is going to talk about amputees as it relates to Gettysburg, the left-handed Army Corps. These are people that lost their left hand or their right arm or right hand in writing contests. We know how much amputations dealt with in the American Civil War. So it's going to be an interesting topic. We'll see you back here at 11 o'clock, everybody.